Welcome, everybody, to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Cuello, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We do this through online presentations and interviews with guest speakers, as well as classes and study groups. And we draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading-edge studies in science, consciousness, spirituality, and philosophy. And we've been doing this since 2003. And in 2020, we began recording our presentations on Zoom. So our video recordings, if you miss one and want to see it, they are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org. Just go to the video library tab, and also on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep our program going. If you enjoy our presentations and would like to support this program, we'd appreciate it. You can make a donation on any page of our website, or you can become a member on the membership page and enjoy the benefits of membership. And now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker. Ellen Corman-Mains has practiced and taught meditation for over 4 decades, including years of Kyudo Zen archery, which is very cool, which she taught at Naropa University in Boulder and internationally. After developing chronic fatigue, she turned her attention to healing and then to integrating different ways of knowing and sensing, creating a self-coaching journey called the magical practice of feeling your life. Her work with clients emphasizes radical acceptance, empathic presence, and basic goodness as keys to deepening self-awareness, overcoming obstacles, and inviting ancestral support into our lives. And so welcome, Ellen, and tell us a little bit about your book.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Good. I was telling Gloria we have some snow here in Colorado today, even though we had 80-degree weather earlier in the week. So you never know about the internet, but hopefully it'll stay steady. So welcome, and I am gonna tell you about my book along the way. I'll just show it to you right now. Buried Rivers, A Spiritual Journey into the Holocaust. But I guess I'm going to start in a more general way, in a broader way, and just what's important, what I'd like to talk about tonight, which is my understanding and my experience of how to work with intergenerational trauma, or we could really say any kind of trauma. It's kind of hard to separate, isn't it? Intergenerational trauma, inherited issues from how we were raised, and the collective trauma that is going on in the world. I was listening to one of the other presentations on the Caritas website and hearing about people doing PhD studies on collective trauma as intergenerational trauma, that kind of thing. So it's kind of broad, but in my case specifically, I was born to parents who had just a year before my birth arrived in Canada. from Europe, circuitous journeys, that basically having to escape Poland, and my mother being a direct survivor of the Holocaust, having gone through the Holocaust in ghettos and concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And my father had actually left Poland a little bit before the war, but lost a lot of his family, everyone who stayed behind. My father was actually in South America during the war. So, and I thought it would be especially appropriate to sort of bring that context, that history in, because in 3 days this year is a day of remembrance of the Holocaust called Yom. Yom means day, and Hashoah. I forgot the direct translation of that word from the Hebrew, but it's anyway roughly equivalent to what we now call the Holocaust, which you could say is the largest genocide, if not the only genocide, but the absolutely largest and most documented genocide in history. And so very, the symbol of man's inhumanity to man and the tremendous collective suffering that can occur. So here I am, a little baby born to these parents. And of course, and growing up, I wasn't aware of something like a day of remembrance. And in a way, it feels odd to me to even talk about intergenerational trauma, because it's something I was, you could say, just born into. That was my, what I was living and breathing and experiencing every day, in some sense, was the trauma field, especially of my parents. So part of the fabric of my being, like trying to look at your own eyes without a mirror. But because of that childhood, I guess I'm just going to just roughly touch on two main aspects of it. One, the pervasive sense of stress, low-level fear, anxiety that was always around my mother, that she kind of just, especially at that time, less as she, progressed in her own life. But this was shortly after, not many years after, literally escaping with nothing and having lost everyone in her family except for one brother. So there was that sense of survival orientation and mistrust and anxiety that I didn't feel as a child, but I constantly felt around me. And then a kind of absence that I felt, in a way, because the whole focus was on physical survival and just earning a living and having security of a home and food. Food was so important. There was a kind of absence on the emotional level. I don't think I experienced that anyone ever knew how I was feeling as a child. And this is sort of like me trying to, learning retrospectively what normal child rearing should look like, probably does look like, and sort of feeling a kind of absence in that area where my parents were doing the best they could, but maybe just not able to be sufficiently there for me as a young child. And that, I think, had a lot to do with a sense of loneliness and sort of feeling that feeling of something being missing, and then pursuing a spiritual path. Actually, I wasn't looking for a spiritual path, but I happened to meet my spiritual teacher at the age of 19. So there was just a sense of, in addition to the sense of absence, also somewhere in the background, a sense of sadness, a heaviness for no apparent reason. So what I'd like to do now is, because I feel like this is a sharing on a very personal level, and experiential, not really coming to this topic with a lot of intellectual concepts. So I'd like to bring us together in this space by inviting you to participate with me in a kind of attunement. You could call it a little brief meditation, but it's an attunement. And I get that word mainly from the focusing tradition that has been part of my training. And focusing, we could say, is a way of deeply listening and bringing the body and the mind together. So sort of acknowledging what's here, how we are, and sort of, because our minds are so busy and we are busy creatures, it's sort of like different parts are operating separately. And the topic is also about keys to wholeness. And this is a big part of it, is actually including whatever we're experiencing. So I'll just lead us through this, if that's okay. So we'll take a few moments to just notice how you are. And it helps to first connect with the sense of earth, the sense of body. So you might just feel what your body is sitting on. Maybe notice your feet on the floor. And just invite your awareness to come a little bit more into your body. And notice how your body is feeling. There may be tiredness, there may be some aches and pains somewhere. So the idea is just to include exactly how we are right now. Maybe take a deeper breath. And appreciate the fact that we are in this moment safe and that we're supported. And you could also include your awareness of the room around you that is in some way also supporting you. You might notice the parts of your body that are flowing, where the energy feels relaxed, open. Maybe some areas that feel tense. Or just different. And just see if you can stay connected with that sense of like a flat bottom to your experience. And you might also then notice how your mind is, how busy your mind is, or active, or spaced out. You might notice something that's on your mind that you're thinking about, something that happened today. Still feeling that grounded quality. And then also just touch lightly, sort of inquire very lightly about how you are feeling emotionally. Just notice that, just the mood. Whether it's been a bit of a roller coaster, or even whether there's a pervasive quality of any kind, or just an okayness. So just noticing whatever is there, and really sort of saying, welcoming the whole of our experience. And just notice how that is to just be with that. So there's a quality of inclusiveness and a quality of not judging and giving a sort of positive value to just being able to be with whatever is here. And we can also notice that we're in this group, this lovely group. So there's also a sense of the light sense of connection that we are here together. Now I'd also like to invite you to touch in with your heart. And by heart, I mean maybe something that really matters to you. Something that may be really up for you in your life right now. Something that you feel dedicated to in terms of perhaps what you're trying to develop and grow in yourself or share with others. Your concern about the world. So not to get too intellectual about it, but just see if there's something there. Or it could be the interest that brought you here today. So kind of like the aspiration or inspiration that might also be here. And as we do this, we're sort of allowing ourselves to inhabit more fully all of that, and maybe inhabit a little more fully why we're here. And even if things are not lining up that easily and we feel scattered, just acknowledging that is a kind of aligning. It's a kind of acceptance that is unconditional. It allows more alignment to happen, but that alignment might take the form of not being so aligned. right off the bat. So we'll just take another moment or two with that. You're always welcome to jot things down, of course. I do that a lot. And then we can gently bring ourselves slowly back into the space, the shared space of the room. Just whenever it feels right, you can open your eyes if they've been closed. So I think in a moment I'll just see if anybody would like to share anything, because it might it would be interesting just to hear the space that you're in, and maybe if anything interesting arose, doing that attunement together. But I think I want to start by just pointing out what I feel are the most essential keys in working with trauma and intergenerational trauma. And is that a hand already? I'm guessing that you have something to share.
Yeah, whenever is appropriate.
Okay.
Okay.
I didn't see your
Great.
hand. Sorry, Rob.
No, it
That's
was
okay.
this kind of hand.
Oh, I see.
I happened to catch it. Yeah. Yeah. So, and I've been contemplating this quite a bit the last couple of days. Like, what does it really boil down to? And so I think one of the big keys is our tendency to judge, our tendency to judge ourselves. And then, of course, we do that all over the place. But we judge our experience, we judge our thoughts, we have an idea of what should be. And in a way that's all very healthy. But this judging, and we'll talk about it more as we continue and break it down a little bit more. But when we take an attitude of simply accepting what's there without judgment, something changes within ourselves. We actually become aligned with a bigger space, a larger space, and the possibility of more intelligence and more of the larger field, you could say, that is there to support us. So when we don't judge, all kinds of doors can open from there. And the other point is tolerating a level of not knowing, not being sure about things. But as I worked with these two ideas more and more, I really found that this first one is the most powerful, probably because it's an antidote to what we're constantly doing to ourselves and the fragmentation that therefore cannot sort of cannot be reconnected to the wholeness. So, Bob, would you like to share? Be great.
Sure. And it only came up at the end when you asked about did anything come up? And I'm not sure what you said that kind of triggered it. But I just, for context, what got me interested in the talk, the title, Intergenerational Healing, Intergenerational Trauma and Reclaiming Wholeness, was something that really rings back to, sort of dysfunction in family around chemical dependency and alcoholism, and it being a family disease and affecting, across generations. It has no boundaries. And my dad, so that's sort of just a little context. My dad had been in World War II and had befriended and was befriended by a lot of Germans, even though they were, at odds. And there's different stories that were interesting. But he ended up being in the group that liberated Buchenwald, which was a concentration camp. And he this was in real juxtaposition to how he felt about the Germans in general, which is he liked them. He, after liberating Buchenwald, which was close to town, from what I understand, was back in town and talking to people that he had already, met in some way or felt some familiarity. And so, how could you let this go on in your town? How could you, the human atrocities? And I think the answer that he got was, well, we didn't know what was really going on there. And so it's sort of interesting that there can be things that we're somewhat, any one of us are somewhat insulated from. Maybe we don't know, even though there could be something horrific that's pretty close by. And then he, just by way of background, he was certainly one that would tend to judge. Didn't find a whole lot of gray area. Things were either right or wrong, or moral. I appreciate, sort of what you led us through, and I hope that's a reasonable contribution. And I know it's sort of a lot to drop into the conversation, but thank you.
No, thank you very much.
Seems very relevant to me. Right.
Yeah. This, by the way, this in my book, there's a blurred photograph in the background. These are people in the ghetto, in the Łódź or Lodz ghetto in Poland. And this little boy in the corner, I realized in 2011 was my uncle.
My
uncle was in Auschwitz for a number of months and then went on the death march to Buchenwald and was there until they were liberated, and actually interacted and I share his story in my story. So I kind of weave some of what he wrote down before his death. And he talks about interacting with the, townspeople, and how didn't you know, and, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing up the, sort of the memory. He had a couple of stories I'll just share super quickly. He worked a lot by himself because he was in demolition, like blowing up bridges so that the enemy couldn't use them. And he was on the Rhine River, and he literally was getting shot at from the other side by the Germans. And the next day he put a horse blanket. I was riding a German horse, and he put a horse blanket on it and said, "Your horse, not mine." And as he was going down the river, so if they were taking a shot at him, they would see written on the side of the horse, "This is your horse, not mine." And so I think he was playful that way. He also told the story of being put up by a German a woman who was taking care of a house for a family. I guess a lot of the family was gone. She actually let him stay in the house. The Germans came. She hid him in the house. And Germans were doing the army was doing their, looking for prisoners and defectors and, sympathizers and who knows what all they call them. But he had learned to speak German. He had learned to sort of move amongst them, somewhat, and again became very, close to them. And then also appalled by how they could let that go on in their communities, kind of thing. The atrocities and the human trauma.
Suzanne?
Yes.
Has her hand up. Thank you, Bob.
Yes, thank you. Yes, as a matter of fact, your sharing has also brought up for me a similar story. My father was in World War II. He was at Buchenwald as a political prisoner. He was amongst about 87 Americans and another similar number of other Allied flyers who were considered political prisoners. They'd been captured in Paris and were transported over to Buchenwald. And to make a long story short, he saw a lot of what was happening there, unfortunately. But in the end, probably by a miracle, one of the Americans could speak German, captured the attention of a German officer, and was able to explain their situation. So before they were executed because they did not want to work, they were transported over to one of the stalags, and that was stalag number 3, I believe, and he did survive the war. Where I was going with this, two things. My father, I think, never really quite got over his experiences. I mean, there were many, many people who were there. They knew something was going on, and many people sacrificed in order to end that war and that atrocity. And anyway, in his case, I think my dad did suffer some PTSD symptoms throughout his life. It also made him a little less emotionally available. So, I mean, one thing I want to say to you is that we're all in this together, all these families, whether they were families, that were gassed, or their relatives and descendants, or otherwise, whole nations are there, and you're really not alone when all is said and done, and that helps in the healing. And then number 2, for me personally, I was able, through a French historian who contacted me, because you see, my father was shot down in his plane. He was a pilot, and he stayed with the French underground and resistance for quite a while. He was eventually captured, but I was able to visit with many of the French people who risked their lives to help him to escape. And I know of many stories like that. And so I feel a real personal connection with all of those people, and a real heart-centered place, which also helps with the overall healing. And I just wanted to share a little bit about that story with you. And there's probably more for me here, because I'm working on generational healing as well with my grandmothers on an entirely different issue. So I'm very, very looking forward to more of what you want to share there, Ellen. And just thank you so much, and for everyone who's listening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think what you said is pointing to where we're going, which is, I think we all know that trauma causes a kind of fragmentation. It's a response to something that we find overwhelming. And it's not the event itself, but it's the subjective experience of it that can simply be so overwhelming that we have to isolate it and put the memory even out of our awareness. And so there's a part of ourselves, or a part of our experience, that we simply separate from the rest of us. And how do you, if we do that a lot, we end up, and in a certain way, that is the way our lives are, is we are so fragmented and compartmentalized. And it's hard to find, especially as society gets so polarized, and the level of aggression that we know is out there. The sense of safety and the ability to relax and include and remember those parts are very challenged. So anyway, the interconnectedness is the nature of our reality, of the underlying nature of reality. And so, yeah, that just has everything to do with how to heal and what we can actually, how we can actually help that process. So thank you. And I think there was another hand.
I don't see one at the moment.
Okay.
I was wondering, Ellen, when you were growing up, what kind of community did you grow up in? Was it, you know, like a Jewish community? Or was it, what kind of community did you grow up in?
Well, I grew up in Montreal, and it's an interesting place because, you know, it's predominantly French speaking.
Yes.
And yet, especially at that time, the English minority were kind of dominant in the hierarchical, in the, you know, society. And immigrants chose to send their children to English-speaking schools. So we already had this kind of divided society in a way. And then there was also a lot of division in terms of whether it was the Roman Catholic school system, the French Roman Catholic school system, or the English-speaking Protestant school system. So anyway, I grew up in the English-speaking Protestant school system, and in a neighborhood that was partly Jewish, but also quite a number of other immigrants. So quite a melting pot of different peoples.
Mm-hmm.
And then it depended a lot on your specific neighborhood and school. So whereas my elementary school was really a mixture, my high school seemed more like a WASP-y kind of place, although there was certainly a, you know, I don't know, maybe 20% may have been Jewish. Recently, we had a high school reunion that was sort of had to be rescheduled, but I was surprised to come across a number of people who were obviously Jewish, and my recollection was that nobody was Jewish in that high school. But so anyway, kind of a mixture. My parents' friends were almost exclusively Polish Jews.
I see.
So the people who they visited with, who were their friends. And so it was a little bit like, you know, growing up in a mixture of different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my mother, I had to help my mother write my notes when I, you know, was sick and absent from school. My parents spoke a number of languages, but English was the last one that came along.
Interesting. How did your mother get out? How did she escape? You said she escaped.
I don't know if escape is the right word. Well, it's all in the book.
Oh, it's in the book.
My mother, I really knew very, very little, almost nothing. I mean, I didn't even know my grandparents' names. I knew just almost nothing about my family beyond my two parents and my one uncle, and a couple cousins on my father's side. So my mother was born in central Poland in the city Lodz, and where I have now spent quite a lot of time and learned a lot more. So she was the eldest of 5 children. This was the second largest ghetto in Europe. in Poland, Warsaw Ghetto being the largest one. The Lodz Ghetto was the longest lasting ghetto also, because the organizer of the ghetto, it was a very industrial city, and so they organized into little mini factories where they produced goods for the Germans. And so it was a big textile town. And my mother was a seamstress.
Mm-hmm.
So they made themselves valuable, and therefore there are actually more survivors, more Holocaust survivors, percentage-wise, from Lodz than any other location, I believe, any other place. So many, many Jews were brought from other locations in Europe, like from Germany, to the Lodz Ghetto. And they were, of course, even though they were working, they were being starved at the same time. So they were barely able to survive. Over 40,000 people died of illness and starvation and freezing. My grandfather was amongst those who died that way. And they also would periodically round people up and send them to a nearby extermination camp. And I think the estimate is that about 200,000 people were exterminated in Chelmno, which is only about a little more than an hour away from Łódź. And it was one of the very first where they were experimenting with gas as a way of mass killing. So there was originally about 235,000 Jews living in Łódź. And then many more were brought into the place, into the ghetto. Toward the end of the war, in July and August of 1944, there was somewhere between 60 and 70,000 people who were still alive and working in the Łódź Ghetto. The Germans recognized that they were going to lose the war, and they made it a top priority to start expediting massive transports from the Łódź Ghetto to Auschwitz. But this was only in these last 2 months of the ghetto's existence. So in July and August, about 60,000 people literally were transported by train to Auschwitz. And my mother and her mother and the 3 remaining siblings, one sibling had been shot, were sent to Auschwitz. And my grandmother was immediately sent to the gas chamber. And of the 4 siblings, my mother survived, and 1 brother, and the more details are in the book. My mother and her younger sister, my mother was the eldest, her sister was the baby. She had 3 brothers and a sister who was about 8 years younger. They were sent to Ravensbrück, which is a concentration camp for women near Berlin. And this was a place especially for political prisoners, so not primarily Jewish inmates, but this was a place where the Germans were also, some major German companies were using these women for labor. So my mother and her sister were sent there. And in April of 1945, there was a prisoner negotiation made. I'm forgetting at this moment the names of the parties who negotiated this, but 10,000 prisoners were released and to be sent under the auspices of the Red Cross to Sweden. My mother and her sister were in a transport heading to Denmark and then to Sweden. And the transport that she was in was bombed. and her sister was killed in that bombing. And that is one of the only stories that my mother shared with me in a kind of vivid way and with a kind of full intensity of what that was like for her. So she told me that she stepped out and somebody was pointing a rifle at her, and she said, "Go ahead and kill me." And she said that someone else stepped between her and the rifle and said, "If you shoot her, you shoot me first." And she was taken to Sweden, and I believe she was in a very caring place with other women. And that is where she sort of came back to life. My book is full of interesting synchronicities. And part of what I want to talk about is the magic that happens. And synchronicity is an aspect of that magic. And 3 or 4 years ago, I was in Lodz at one of the commemoration events, and which we were outside in this large park called Survivors Park. And at the end of it, we were going to go inside and have some refreshments. And there was a woman next to me, and something said to me, "Say hello to that woman." And I thought, well, she's probably American. And so I introduced myself. It turned out that she was about my age, and she was from Sweden. She lived in Sweden. And somehow, in the next 5 or 10 minutes, she just shared with me the story that her mother had been in the Lodz ghetto, in Auschwitz, in Ravensbrück, and then rescued to Sweden, and that she was in this transport and witnessed the transport in front of her that was bombed. She had no idea that my mother was in that transport. And I heard this story from my mother when I was 14 years old. And so now I was in my late 60s and finally had a kind of objective, someone else telling me that that story was true. And it was kind of like, just kind of amazing to have that little voice in my ear saying, "Talk to this woman." So anyway, this is not at all what I was going to talk about. As I was saying before, I met my spiritual teacher at the age of 19. And I think feeling this kind of and this atmosphere of tightness, mistrust, anxiety. The Buddhist teachings were, like a salve for my being. And I was just so drawn to hearing that there was a possibility of living from a place of openness, and that there was some kind of larger reality in which that wasn't driven, or that there was another world out there, and that one could expand, one could open up into that world. So there was a sense of profundity and truth that I recognized in my teacher. And at the same time, it felt like there was also room for that sadness, that I didn't have to try to be somebody I wasn't. And just to say, is anybody here practiced or studied Buddhism? Is that familiar to anybody particularly?
A little
Okay.
bit.
Yeah, so just to say a few words about that. The idea is Buddhism isn't exactly a religion. It's really based on following the example of the Buddha, but it's based on the fact that we inherently within us possess this wisdom and this intelligence, this clarity, this openness, this compassion, and that all these things are actually part of what you could say is Buddha nature, our innate, inherent wisdom. But there's a quality about being a human being where there's this fundamental uncertainty that we experience. And one way to go is to try to eliminate that uncertainty. And instead of recognizing things as impermanent and interconnected, the tendency is to try to establish the security of having a solid, permanent self, that I really exist as me, and therefore everything around me is sort of I use to secure, to kind of reflect my own security. So in other words, if you're real, well, then I know I'm sort of I know who I am because of who you are to me. So there's this kind of like figuring out our relationship to things in this way that's really trying to solidify something. And it never really fully happens, but it's something we're constantly trying to do, is get rid of that uncertainty. And there are some basic facts about our lives that are usually talked about in Buddhism, such as this impermanence and the fact that there is some quality of suffering, and to try to understand what causes that suffering or what makes that. I mean, there's some kind of suffering just by virtue of having a body, being born, becoming ill, dying, so there's a certain level of suffering that's just part of life. And then there's also how we create more suffering for ourselves. And so in terms of juggling and creating that sense of solidity, we are always evaluating whether a situation or a person is good for us or, not good for us. So we are either trying to bring it closer and have more of that, create more pleasure, and push away from ourselves anything that feels like it's, not good for us. So we sort of simplify the world into it's for me, it's against me, or actually it doesn't really matter. And so that's the attitude of ignorance or not caring. So passion, aggression, and ignorance. And in the Shambhala teachings, so my teacher was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was a Tibetan Buddhist master, but also introduced the teachings of Shambhala, which is a little bit more of a secular approach. And in those teachings, they're actually rather similar, but presented sort of differently. And there he presented the sort of root of our difficulty as this fear in the background, as some kind of anxiety. And in a way, it goes back to the same principle that we find in the Buddhist teachings, this sort of uncertainty and then sort of just wanting to cover that up. So fear plays a big role, and fear, anxiety is, we can see how that is gets in the way of our being open and expansive and compassionate. And at the same time, and meditation is really the discipline that allows us to tap into that sort of sense of space, the sense of spaciousness that's around us and is also part of us. So it's a sort of organic process, and that's why it's based on our own experience. Another thing meditation does, though, is allow us to notice our thinking. So we don't try to eliminate thinking in Buddhist meditation so much as notice our thinking. So things slow down, and we get to notice that quality of judgment and evaluating and judging ourselves, which is extremely intense in Western culture, even more so than in Eastern culture. I'm just rethinking what to share with you. And
Suzanne has.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, Ellen, if you could elaborate just a little bit more on how you feel that the meditation processes and the philosophy of Buddhism, which you have learned, how a little more concretely how you feel that has assisted you in healing some of your feelings that you've had to overcome from your childhood.
Sure. Yeah, good question. And that makes me want to read this little bit. Yeah, and the answer is, that the things that are in your childhood don't necessarily go away, but they don't entirely go away. But meditation definitely, and also having a living teacher who kind of transmits that with his being or her being, there is a sense that other way of being, that openness is available. And I think that helped me a lot. And even before becoming a Buddhist, I think also I had this sort of sense that I would never reject people on the basis of what their nationality or their religion was, or the color of their skin, or that kind of thing. So there was that sense of openness. And at the same time, openness can allow us to, when the time is right, to sense more of what is in our being that hasn't, childhood memories or whatever it is. In other words, more layers that are in us to come up. So I think I'm just going to share the experience from which this book came, which is that I happened to be in Germany. I was at a little conference having to do with the Zen archery practice that I had done for many years. And I was taking a train. The meeting happened to be in Germany, and I was on a train to Paris. It was January 2005. Through the train's gaping windows, dismal surroundings stretched on monotonously. The flat horizon and gray sky punctuated only by isolated sheds and wire fences, as if even the trees had died. I couldn't help thinking about a different kind of train and destination. My head registered a kind of atmospheric pressure in the background, like a dense cloud bearing down on me from the space above. Outside, I noticed an abundance of chain link fences topped with double or triple rows of barbed wire. Here and there, a chimney churned out smoke, a darker gray than the sky. My awareness returned to the vague heaviness above me like an enormous swarm of insects. As I paid it more attention, it seemed to become more real and palpable, and I grew more curious. And then it clicked. Oh, of course, there would be some residue of the Holocaust hovering over Germany. How could it not be here? The silent train's seamless movement had simply allowed me to sense what was already here, a conglomeration of pain and sorrow, a leftover package of energy hanging over Germany on this late January day. As I continued sensing it, the heaviness grew steadier and more solid, like a soup congealing as it cooled, allowing itself to be felt or examined from all sides. I told myself it all made sense and that anyone would notice this if they were still enough to pay attention. Something present in the atmosphere, as real as everything else, just invisible. So I think that's possibly, part of my meditation training, which since I've been meditating since I was quite young, it's hard for me to, distinguish it as something unique and separate. But in fact, I have been able to tune in more to the environment. And you could say that whenever we're not overly focused on ourselves, worrying about ourselves, that is what happens. We naturally open to other things, other people, and the environment. I switched to a seat on the other side of the train. I'm not sure why, maybe to face the direction the train was moving instead of what was behind. I wondered if something would shift in my new seat, but the heaviness persisted unchanged. I must have grown restless because my mind wandered for a moment, and then I felt a shudder pass through my sternum, like feathers brushing through the tissue and ribs. With it came a putrid sensation too repulsive to inhale, like the smell of rotting meat. As it touched the inner space beneath my ribs, something in me recoiled and went numb. Within moments, my throat felt sore and swollen. Was it my imagination, or was there a connection between my raw throat and the oppressive cloud, as if some invisible tentacle had injected me with its contents? I shivered in my jacket and tried nestling into my seat, but the tight fabric had no give. So I get to Paris and I'm disoriented and I'm not feeling well. And I knew that something had touched me. And eventually I didn't know, another synchronicity, I had no idea, but this was this week that I was traveling and arriving in Paris was the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it was declared that year to be International Holocaust Remembrance Day by the United Nations. I had no idea about that. But I learned about it in Paris because they were dedicating this new Holocaust memorial, and it was on the news, etc. When I came back to Boulder, I continued to be ill, but also I felt like I wasn't myself. And I started calling my healers and a friend who I'd been meeting with every so often, who was, I don't know if you'd call her a medium or a psychic, but she would deliver a kind of intuitive message for me. And so I'd like to read a little bit from that message as well. It began with an apology for the touch I had received on the German train. It's not that we are unpleasant, she said in her ordinary voice, but what happened to us was so unnerving that we give off that energy when beings come close. Yourself was not there during that time. You felt it strongly because of the touch, but it is not something that will stay with you. Then Elizabeth's voice deepened. Why did we contact you? Was I supposed to know the answer? Why did you bother coming here today? She asked more forcefully. To be of benefit, I said awkwardly. Not just your own benefit, but the people you will touch. You can spread something that needs to be brought out. The Holocaust has not been completely ignored in Buddhism. Some of what has been written, spoken, or communicated about the Holocaust is correct and clear. But you need to look more deeply at the connection between you, the Holocaust, and Buddhism. These three need to come together. You need to look into this and write something or teach about it for us and for yourself as well. I couldn't help asking, who are you? We are not your family, but a new family. Yourself's family has dispersed and gone on. They have not stayed with this experience. They have dealt with this life and gone elsewhere. They are not in pain. But not every spirit was able to digest this after their death. This was an extremely difficult thing. Whenever something this difficult happens, the spirit can grow with it or not. Some could deal with it and go on, some did not and are still processing. That is why the Holocaust stays in people's minds and doesn't go away. People bring it back into their reality. It needs to be thought about more. The spirits you connected with on the train are still working this out. They are in pain and they need this to be spoken of. They need the Buddhist perspective. When you write about this, not only do you help the world's understanding, but it will help them. These spirits have no concept of Buddhist thought. Because yourself is Jewish, you can bring this to them. Yourself has the philosophy of the primary goodness of human beings. The Holocaust is as far as you can get from that. You need to put these things together to help yourself and to help them. This is your bodhisattva opportunity to do something amazingly positive. It is primarily something you can do for others, but you also receive a gift. As you process this and make the connections, the people who need to know about your work will know it. It goes out into the universe, and there is also a healing for yourself. It's like the future is coming and grabbing you. So, this was rather unexpected, and this was something that also answered a kind of frustration that I had in my life, which was that I couldn't understand why I was born into the family I was born into. And my parents had a very hard time not disowning me, frankly, for practicing Buddhism. It was quite a dance that I had to do to work that out with them. and to show them that I was loyal to my family and to where I had come from. So having this message kind of brought these two parts of who I was together. And I actually felt like I finally had some clue what might be the purpose of my life, or, how to make sense of this. And so that's what drove me to find out more about the Holocaust. And actually, I had no idea what to do in response to this, other than that I felt there was some truth in it. But finally, I had this out of the blue notion that I should travel to Poland. And so that became another whole journey, in that I reconnected with something through just being there and interacting with the place and the people and the culture. That was a kind of magical rediscovery of a part of myself. Yeah, I'm going to pause here for a moment. Yeah, I wanted to share just pull out a couple points from the things that I'm sharing, because it's kind of so much in a way. I want to come back to this idea of going beyond judgment. And that happens on both a conceptual level and an emotional level. Or rather, when we are not picking and choosing and able to not judge our experience, and able to tolerate a kind of not knowing and touch into that larger space. And when there's a kind of relaxation about our experience, then there's also a natural curiosity. And that curiosity is also a key word for me. That curiosity isn't, we think of it as intellectual curiosity, but it's also a kind of openness or vulnerability in the heart. And so curiosity is what allows this kind of meeting between different realms, different peoples, different parts of our own being, what allows them to sort of come together. And allows a kind of magic to happen. And I want to share the sense of magic that my teacher wrote about in the book Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior. By magic, we do not mean unnatural power over the phenomenal world, but rather the discovery of innate or primordial wisdom in the world as it is. The unconditioned wisdom and power of the world that are beyond any dualism. It is wisdom beyond aggression, realizing that your own wisdom as a human being is not separate from the power of things as they are. We are talking about how we actually perceive reality. It is possible to contact energy that is beyond dualism, beyond aggression, energy that is neither for you nor against you. And again, that is that sense of not judging whether something is good or bad, supports me or doesn't support me. And in the Shambhala teachings, that quality of magical presence, you could say, or magical interaction with the phenomenal world is called drala, which means beyond an enemy, beyond duality. So drala is connecting the wisdom of your own being with the power of things as they are. If you are able to connect those two things, out of that, you can discover magic in everything. But although magic is always available, what allows you to discover it? The only way to contact that energy is to experience a gentle state of being in yourself. So the discovery of drala is not coincidental. To connect with the fundamental magic of reality, there has to be gentleness and openness in you already. Otherwise, there is no way to recognize the energy of non-aggression in the world. So we could say that magic is the natural expression of our interconnectedness. And so whenever we bring two things that have been kind of separated into relationship, something magical arises, even if it's just, it may not be something magical, in the sense of extraordinary, but it is the extraordinary quality of connectedness which we experience. So the question is, how can we be with feelings, reactions, behaviors that we may feel ashamed of, uncomfortable with, that we ourselves judge? And so I'm suggesting that this practice of non-judgment is a kind of revolutionary way of transforming those, of allowing things to transform. And so in this case, in the case of being with our own feelings, that magic happens paradoxically, almost by us becoming less identified with the feelings and recognizing that actually we are a larger space that is having, in which that feeling is occurring. When we identify with a specific feeling, so we're identified with it, and then we're simultaneously judging it and simultaneously trying to strategize how we can change it. And this is where the Buddhist training that I received for many, many years was actually enriched by the work I did in focusing, and specifically in what's called inner relationship focusing. And there, in that system, the idea is that we bring an attitude of self in presence, and any part of us that's kind of experiencing distress or confusion or shame, whatever it is, we sort of act as if self and presence is there simply by establishing that relational quality. So instead of, an example might be, I am furious. I'm very angry at so-and-so. And then when we speak in the language of self and presence, we would probably say, something in me is really angry. And if we say those two phrases, I'm really angry, and then say, something in me is really angry, I know even as I'm saying them right now, I can feel, I mean, I've done this quite a bit, so, but I can feel that difference.
Shift.
So yeah, there's a space between the awareness that is holding it and the feeling, the part that is hurt, that is suffering, that is judging itself. And so we're actually made up of many parts. And so when we create this larger space and become neutral, you could say, so the definition of self and presence is the ability to accommodate anything without judgment. And yeah, so these are practices, actually. Focusing is a practice that's usually done in partnerships. So there are focusing oriented therapists, but there are also people who just learn focusing. And there's definitely a way that the skills one learns in focusing, and meditation, they just sort of bring out or highlight certain things more strongly. And I think this quality of not judging ourselves and inviting a larger field, even if it's just through that shift in our own language, can help shift our relationship. Now, as it happens, it's much easier to do focusing with another person who's simply listening and they're not doing anything. But so there's a quality of self and presence that is contagious. So just the presence of other human beings who have a similar intention augments that. And, if we want to talk about polyvagal theory and fight or flight and all of that, it's also works with the concept or the practice of co-regulation. So co-regulation, being with another non-judgmental nervous system who is simply there, helps us to do the same thing. So there are ways that we can do it for ourselves through our languaging, through learning a practice like focusing. Meditation is definitely a practice for developing the friendliness to ourselves and ability to notice the voice in which we're talking to ourselves, notice the aggression, the self-aggression, and then to occasionally notice something larger, this larger mind, this larger awareness that is also part of us, but is usually just covered over.
Rob had his hand up for a long time.
Oh,
You want
please
to
go ahead.
Yeah, and I hope this isn't too much of a detour, but in looking at the Holocaust, I've kind of see these millions and over many years, and some of the genocide going back to even World War I, and wanting to cleanse of the African population that had been there, and Hitler sort of playing on that sentiment. and accelerating the process, which, you know, really got us, I guess, into the Holocaust. And I don't know that much about it, but to me, as I have a Native American partner who, you know, their genocide has been going on for hundreds of years, you know, not like tens of years, but hundreds, like 300 years. And, you know, when they look at Thanksgiving, it's almost like, you know, National Holocaust Day in some way, like a Holocaust like perverse celebration, you know, because there's so much history in early Thanksgiving of the Hallmark version with everybody getting along and, you know, learning how to plant and garden together versus the, you know, heads will roll on and using human heads, Indian heads as soccer balls on those days. You know, sort of how does the non-judgmental and the you know, the tolerate not knowing, how do you span, you know, not just the thing that went, you know, you and I are a generation away from knowing people who were involved in the Holocaust, but you go to the Native Americans and it's, you know, it's tens of generations or hundreds of years. Like, does that come up in your work?
Well, you know, I was going to mention this, and so it's good that you brought it up. So it's interesting, this whole thing about not judging, because, and talking about basic goodness. So this is a technique for working with our own trauma or helping each other work with our own trauma. It's not saying that there's no judgment for the perpetrators or the systemic, you know, racism that's going on, or, you know, the systemic genocide that's going on, you know. So we kind of have to separate those levels. So I'm talking about healing on a more personal level. And that could, of course, if we had the perpetrators in the room, that would be just as much for them, right? But we're talking about the shame, and you could say, so I've also been studying recently with Daniel Foor on ancestral healing, and with Thomas Hubel, who's very well known in collective and ancestral healing work. And I just lost my little train of thought, but I was definitely going somewhere. Yeah, so where I was going was he talks about ethical transgression. So trauma, and this kind, especially on this level, always we're talking about a kind of fundamental transgression of human rights, right? And so there's a correction, there's a kind of collective reckoning and correction that needs to occur on a social level. But in order to even bring those about, we're in a better place to do it if we have if we're connected in the best way possible with our own wounds that we're carrying. So in other words, if our wounds just result in us perpetrating the same, you know, when the victim becoming the perpetrator, you know, if Israelis are perpetrating genocide on Palestinians because of the Holocaust, and that may be a slight oversimplification, but there's some truth in that, isn't there? You know, so how do we not do that? And how we not do that is by individually and collectively doing our own healing. And to unwind that, we cannot do that while we're blaming or judging, actually. So it starts on this very personal level of recognizing and opening to the shock and shame and whatever else is in there that hasn't been able to express itself, to be empathized with, to be understood. And ultimately, that is what's being asked for. Is so, in my journey, strangely enough, has been communicating, or I don't know about communicating, but occasionally having these messages from the dead and saying, well, you could help us. And then I'm trying to figure, well, how can I help them? And partly it was recognizing that it was my own relationship with my own basic goodness that I needed to become stronger in. And we are somehow in communication, so that my journey literally affects them.
Yeah, and there's a universal applicability, I think, to what you're saying, right? Because if you just Google examples of genocide, right, you go to Wikipedia and you'll find, 40 listed or something, right? And Native Americans don't happen to be on there, which can make you angry right there. But the
I'm turning on a light because it's getting dark here.
The common thread or the common denominator, it seems, is, like you said, if like the stories you hear about people in wartime, putting down their gun and walking away, I'm just not going to go there anymore. I'm not going to be aggressive. I'm not going to seek to kill somebody else. And it seems like it's that personal journey that is what will stop these collections of people that do these horrible things. It kind of has to be people that say, I won't do it.
Mm.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Yeah, let's all take a breath.
Ellen, are you familiar with systemic family constellations? Bert Hellinger's work?
Yes.
Have you experienced that? Because it's all about, it has a lot of relevance to transgenerational trauma and healing.
Yes. I first learned about it in Poland, in fact, because the work went from Germany to Poland, the next door neighbor. And then I learned about it here. And I was quite interested in it. I've only experienced it a couple of times. Well, maybe 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether it was, it had to do with, I think the insight and ability of the leader is really important.
Absolutely.
I did not, I had some experiences, but I was not, they were not, really transformative for me. So I remain very interested, and I'm sure there's a lot of potential and power in that people have experienced. And maybe you would like to share, Gloria, that would be fine. But anyway, I don't feel like I'm an expert in that, and I haven't experienced it personally as having, shifted things. For me, it's been more this sort of gradual process of recognizing that the way Thomas Hübl is working with things and the way my focusing training has taught me to work with myself and my Buddhist training, how these are all sort of coming together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it just inspires more and more confidence in that.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any questions? We're in the last 20 minutes or so. I see a hand. Suzanne.
Well, one more thing to say. In my academic background, I'm a cultural anthropologist. And one of the things that hasn't been mentioned that I think is, or maybe it has, but not emphasized, and that is that we focus on differences, cultural differences, rather than the things that make us all so human. You know, it's a human family. And I was reminded of a story also from World War II. I don't know where I heard this, but the essence of it was that an American or one of the Allies on the ground was searching around for the enemy and came across a pond or a lake. And a German man in his army clothing was on a nearby bush, was taking a bath. And of course, the tendency would be, okay, I'm going to get this German. He's the enemy. But he reported, I couldn't do it. The man was naked. And I realized this man looks just like me in his human nakedness. And I could not do it. I left the area. But, you know, the point being, sometimes in our judgments, we have to begin to raise above our own cultural, what shall I say, prejudices that have become unconscious, and rise above those and see and search out for the commonalities that make us human.
Yes. Yes.
To
And it's
search
actually
out,
the encounter.
Yes, yes, thank you. I'm done. So go ahead. I made my point, and I think it's one we need to be aware of, because we're so immersed in our own culture, in our own language, and the appearance of things that we don't look deeper. And
Yes.
you know, as a practicing meditator in the Buddhist tradition also, that makes you raise above some of these differences, which is, I think, what we need to do. Anything that helps us do that, and prayer and other such methods can also assist us. So I'm done for now.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was
That's
a great
great.
story. That was a great story. You know, it is so much in having to do with the perception that we have and what we project onto other people. And, you know, I was reading today two things, actually. One was a quote by a Sufi teacher, Llewellyn von Lee, and he was talking about meditation and having an eco-spiritual perspective. And what he says, I'll just read this quote: if we are to live the real potential of our spiritual practice, we need to break free from the focus on our own individual journey. We need to reclaim the simple truth that spiritual life is not solely about ourselves and open to a larger, all-embracing vision. If spiritual life is not about the whole, it has lost its true nature. It has instead been subverted by the ego and its patterns of self-concern. I liked that. That really spoke to me. And when you were talking about the difference between saying I am angry and something in me is angry, that came to mind, because it's this difference between identification. When we say I am and then follow it with anything, we are already identified with something that we're not.
And cut ourselves in pieces.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you also, you know, because this quote from Llewellyn von Lee is about what he calls spirituality and spiritual perspective. Has nature helped you? Do you find a connection with nature is a healing thing for you in terms of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think pretty much every human being does, and sometimes it's you can't seem to find any psychological fix, but just being in nature is communicating with you and to that wholeness, to that essential being on a more primordial level. So absolutely.
Yeah.
This, I'd like to read just a couple, a paragraph or two that speaks to both what Suzanne was talking about and what you just spoke to. And this was in 2012 when I went in a bus with students and some descendants like myself to this camp called Hell No near Lodz, and there was a ceremony happening, and there was a local bishop, who decided to hold a mass there at the same time. So it was a little bit awkward because you have these Jewish people sort of hanging around in the background, not really knowing what to do during a Catholic mass. But then at the end of the mass, the leader of the Jewish community, they stood next to each other, and the rabbi started to sing in Hebrew some prayer in a very melodic voice. And so there was, and they were like literally like standing together. And so this is what happened when we went back in the bus. Driving back to Lodz, I noticed how the mood inside the bus had changed, the gentle chirping of voices and the warmth in the air, as if we were wrapped in an enormous spongy womb that was spacious yet intimate. In the flowing chorus between the rabbi and the priest, the universe had shifted. In the energy of their dance, nothing was missing. Every crossing of boundaries, every meeting between enemies or strangers, filled me with the moving radiance of light. Was there really some further discovery I would make about how things worked? The Godot I kept looking for, and by looking for it, never found. Or was it here already in these moments when the barriers dissolved between ourselves and the dead, and between the living, but also between ourselves and nature, we could equally say.
Uh-huh.
I have too much. I guess I had an idea for a closing exercise that we might. Well, I'm going to take it from whatever you guys think. I also have a couple of closing quotes that also bring it from the personal more into, worldview.
Uh-huh.
Maybe I'll read the quotes, and then we'll see if we're in the mood to do a just really short sort of closing exercise, or maybe people have other things they want to say instead. Is that okay? So I was recently reading a book on the science of evil, and it ends with this paragraph. Empathy is a universal solvent. Any problem immersed in empathy becomes soluble. It is effective as a way of anticipating and resolving interpersonal problems, whether this is a marital conflict, an international conflict, a problem at work, difficulties in a friendship, political deadlocks, a family dispute, or a problem with a neighbor. I hope you have been persuaded that this resource is a better way to resolve problems than the alternatives, such as guns, laws, or religion. And unlike the arms industry, which costs trillions of dollars to maintain, or the prison industry and the legal system, which costs millions of dollars to keep oiled, empathy is free. And unlike religion, empathy cannot, by definition, oppress anyone. And to me, empathy is, I think we might make it harder for ourselves to feel empathy, but I think we can get there more easily if we just think of it as the quality of presence without judgment, and notice how that creates a natural openness to the other. And that is empathy, to be able to feel. And then by my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, we tend to think that the threats to our society or to ourselves are outside of us. We fear that some enemy will destroy us, but a society is destroyed from the inside, not from an attack by outsiders. We may imagine the enemy coming with spears and machine guns to kill us, massacre us. In reality, the only thing that can destroy us is within ourselves. If we have too much arrogance, we will destroy our gentleness. And if we destroy gentleness, then we destroy the possibility of being awake. And then we cannot use our intuitive openness to extend ourselves in situations properly. Instead, we generate tremendous aggression. When you are fully gentle, without arrogance and without aggression, you see the brilliance of the universe. You develop a true perception of the universe. Whatever exists in our world is worth experiencing. I think the other point is it's not just about being gentle, but that by having that non-judgment as a kind of basis for listening and being open, we're less reactive, and we can see what is the best thing we can do out in the world also, which might mean an act of war, but to have the intelligence and the clarity to assess situations properly, we can't just be coming from reactivity. And, perpetrator, victim, perpetrator. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else have a question or a comment?
Ellen, who was the author? Was it Rinpoche that said that that last quote that you just read, that a society is destroyed from the inside?
Yes.
And can you tell me the beginning? Because I know a Rinpoche, but I don't know if it's the same Rinpoche.
Oh, yeah. Chogyam Trungpa. I could put it in the chat.
Okay.
He established Naropa, right? He was the
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. I'll look him up. Thank you. That's enough. Thank you.
I was wondering, that quote brought in touched on some of the crises that we're facing right now. And when he talks about how a society is destroyed from within, I can see that happening around us today in this country, so how does this, I'm trying to see what my question is around that. I was thinking, how do you relate these practices to, to today's crises, and also do things like the war in Ukraine, and the climate crisis, trigger a lot of those, those feelings that you may have grown up with, the memories of your family, your ancestors.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a challenge to maintain our tenderness and inspiration, and not to give up hope. And I think we each have to sort of sense or feel, what is our way of contributing? What are we, through our skills, our abilities, our situation, our place, our, just karmically or whatever, what is the little thing that is not a little thing, but what is the specific way in which we can contribute? And to me, that's the way to keep to feel ourselves, to help sort of progress the sense of interconnection, and that there's still some kind of health operating, and I mean, I need to hear messages sometimes like, well, these are the darkest of the dark ages, and it's sort of like the illness coming out, as transformation is happening, as the larger consciousness, as the Caritas Consciousness Project is trying to bring about, this shift in consciousness. And, what will happen, we don't know, but we can only sort of keep our own sort of flame, nurture that flame and encourage others, and spread whatever we can. That does that make sense? Do people feel that?
Absolutely. Working on raising our own frequency helps the collective also. And then from that, we do whatever we can in service to the collective. If it's informed by love, then it's healing. But if it's activism that it comes from a place of anger and rage and frustration, then I think it adds to the problem, right? So it starts with, being present to our own. You started us off with a focus on the heart, and I think that that might be a good way to end as well, because that's where the answers lie, not so much in the brain but in the heart.
Yeah, I see Suzanne smiling, and others.
Yeah. So do you want to take us out?
I want to say something again, if I could.
Sure.
It's you have emphasized, and I especially appreciate this, but I know there's other ways of doing it. But for me, meditation has brought me to a high state. Maybe it's prayer, maybe it's something else people practice. Whatever it is that brings you into that higher state above yourself, that's where you make the connection with the love force. And that's what we all need to do. And that is where we also can, if we haven't quite grasped it, where we can explore, what is my purpose now? What shall I do? Not only for myself, but for others. And so that's what I'm finding for me. And I think that you, Ellen, have also emphasized that in the most beautiful way. And I thank you so much. It's been a marvelous talk.
Mm.
Oh, thank
I'm really
you.
glad
very
to
much,
participate.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
Well, I hope that you keep writing about these very important issues. And thank you for being here this evening, and thank you all who attended. And we'll see you next time. Okay,
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Mhm.
bye.
Thank you.